Sometimes we see a constant inspiratory flow, as we see in breath number 3, constant flow. But we see in breath 1 and 2 and 4, we get a little hump right in the middle of the inspiratory time. What does that indicate to us regarding the targeting scheme? Well, as Victor has suggested to us, and Suzanne puts out spontaneous breaths, yes, indeed. So what's happening here is that if you look at the pressure waveform, we see that at around the time when we get this little hump in the flow waveform, we have a drop in airway pressure. And as Victor has pointed out, this is called flow adaptation on the servo. And what's happening is that the ventilator recognizes a drop in airway pressure. And if it drops far enough, basically 3 centimeters, then the ventilator says, hey, wait a minute, we don't have enough flow going to this patient, so we're going to switch from volume control to pressure control briefly and give the patient as much flow as they want. Now, these are little tiny inspiratory efforts right in the middle of the inspiratory time. And what that does is it just shortens the inspiratory flow time. So why does that happen? Well, because as you know, the area under the flow time curve represents volume. So if you give a little bit of extra flow, you're giving a little bit extra volume, and it doesn't take as long then to deliver the set tidal volume. So in these breaths, they're still mandatory breaths, and as far as we can see, it's still CMV. However, if that inspiratory effort was big enough, then the ventilator would say, wait a minute, I can't control volume anymore. We're going to give the patient as much flow and volume as they want, and the inspiratory time would be terminated by flow. So you'd have then in that situation, you'd have a patient trigger and a patient cycled by flow breath, and that would be a spontaneous breath. Although we don't see that happening here, that could certainly happen at any point. Yes, there goes Ariel. That's your flow triggering. It's still time cycling. The airway pressure drops. The little hump indicates inspiratory effort and some work shifting, as Suzanne pointed out. And so that is what we call dual targeting. So given the fact that you could have a spontaneous breath in here at any time, this is not CMV anymore for this situation. It's IMV. And it's called IMV type 4. It's a very particular type of IMV. Type 4 means that any specific breath can be changed from mandatory to spontaneous if the inspiratory effort is big enough and long enough. So that's IMV. So volume control, IMV type 4, with dual targeting for the both the mandatory and the spontaneous breaths. Because the spontaneous breath couldn't even occur if it wasn't for the dual targeting. So there we go. That's a rather complex explanation of the tag. So now let's take a look at the load. Lots of stuff going on here with the load. As we already pointed out, there's a P must during inspiration, so we could call that a little bit of work shifting, not severe. Anything else that do we see here about the load? Looking specifically at the expiratory flow waveform, what do you see happening there? Anything? What do you guys think? Oh, we got 20 participants out there. That's great. Well, if we take a look at the expiratory flow curve, we see it's kind of straight. We see that it takes a long time to get back to close to being zero. It's not an exponential decay, or if it is, it's a one with a very long time constant. The expiratory flow waveform is consistent, so I wouldn't say that would be expiratory work, expiratory PMUS necessarily. I think that this is probably a patient with high airway resistance, right? So you have a very long time constant. If you were to draw it out, it'd probably take two or three breaths to fully exhale, given what we're seeing here. So Yes. Yeah, there you go, Ari. That's good. Something like that. That would probably be my first thought, that this is high expiratory resistance. Anybody else have any thoughts about that? What do you think, Ari? Looks good?
Yes, something that we need to remark that in this vent on the servo U, we can observe that the initial flow rate is not a 90 rising 90% degree. There is a little inspiratory flow return.
Do you want to show that on the waveform?
Yes, which is right here. Usually in any constant flow shape, it rises 90 degrees. So the initial flow is higher. That could be related to what we see at the beginning of the work, like a little delay triggering and an extra somewhere shifting during the initial part and during the rest of the inspiratory flow.
Yeah, that's a good point. On most ventilators, you can adjust the rise time, but only for the pressure waveform. The servo is different because you can adjust the rise time and the fall time for the flow waveform. You can generate probably an infinite variety of flow wave shapes, which makes interpretation a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, and something to remark is that the inspiratory effort, the extra flow, is only liberated on certain part of the flow, and we can observe that it's not working very well properly because we can see this degree of flow shifting, and there is no extra flow happening during here. It's only happened during this initial part, which to me, I'm kind of questioning the kind of comfort this patient is having at this present time, although this mode is designed to provide an extra flow.
Yeah, at any rate, those little efforts aren't very big. So I don't know that the patient would even notice that they're being uncomfortable, but it's hard to say. Okay, so we got the tag, we got the load. Let's move on to the patient ventilator interaction synchrony problems. If you see any, let's start with trigger. Is this trigger, would you call it normal? Is it early? Is it late? Is it false? Is it failed? What do you think? Again, on this ventilator, these little white lines on the green flow curve indicate it's flow triggering. And the size of the white line, there is some part of the algorithm that indicates how big the trigger effort is. I can't remember exactly how it works in a servo, but the length of the white part of the line means something. I think basically the longer the white line is, the bigger the inspiratory effort was. But anybody think that there's something wrong with the trigger? Is there any desynchrony going on here? Well, first of all, if you were to draw a line, let's look at the expiratory flow curve, and we see that it goes along pretty slow, pretty much as a straight line. Then all of a sudden it shoots up. Can you draw that in for us, Ari?
Yes, I'm doing it. So I'm drawing a line from the beginning of the inspiratory flow and from the deflection of the expiratory flow, which to me is related to an inspiratory effort.
Right, it is. That's exactly right. So given that there is a delay between the patient's inspiratory effort, as indicated by the expiratory flow curve, and the start of inspiratory flow, you could argue on the one hand that that is a delay, a late trigger, right? So the ventilator responds after the patient responds. On the other hand, you could argue, well, the ventilator's triggering normally. It doesn't show that there. I mean, it's probably a very good flow trigger sensitivity, and no matter how sensitive you set the ventilator, it's not going to trigger any faster because the patient has a lot of expiratory flow at the time he's making an inspiratory effort. Then you could say, well, if you had an esophageal pressure catheter, you would see that the patient effort happens first. And if you put the patient on NAVA, that flow delay or that triggering delay might go away. So I suppose you could argue it either way. Any comments on that, Ari?
I cannot see the comments because I'm sharing my screen with
I mean, any comments from you? Nobody has made any comments so far
okay.
since Victor.
Yes, I totally agree. It seems that there is delayed triggering, and what follows after is related to the delayed triggering.
Yeah. Okay, so we already mentioned that during the inspiratory phase, for 3 of these breaths, we're seeing a small amount of work shifting.
Rob,
Yeah,
work shifting during inspiration is, although it doesn't reach the baseline, it has maybe, it is produced in 3/4 of the inspiratory time. It seems like the effort
yeah,
start from the beginning until 3/4 of the breath, and the machine still is failing to provide enough flow.
that's true. That's true. So you see how what is the PEEP on this level? It looks like the airway pressure is going below PEEP, isn't it?
We don't have the settings, but I'm assuming PEEP could be let me see.
Well, if you look at the end expiration, the pressure drops below the pressure at end expiration. So it looks to me like airway pressure is being sucked below PEEP.
Yeah.
So we would probably call that, just but on the basis of that, that's probably extreme work shifting, right? But it's sort of like, it's like isotonic. What do you call it when you push against a static thing? It's
Isometric. It's an isometric
work.
contraction.
Right. So you wouldn't measure much work mathematically because no volume is being moved with the pressure, but the muscles are clearly contracting, right? So they're doing isometric work. You're burning calories. So again, as this relates to comfort, it's probably not comfortable for this patient. So, so we talked about trigger, we talked about inspiration. What about cycle? Is there any indication of early, late cycling going on here? What do you guys think? Late cycle? Victor thinks late cycle. Anybody else have a thought about that? Well, I'm going to have to agree because strictly speaking, those little inspiratory bumps in the flow waveform, that's basically showing you PMUS, right? So when the flow goes up, PMUS is active. When it goes back down, patient's relaxing. But the ventilator continues with inspiration. So technically speaking, you could argue that that is a late cycle, because if you were to put this patient on NAVA again, then the patient would exhale when that bump came down. So we're forcing the patient to have an inspiratory time that's longer than the patient's neuroinspiratory time. And I would say for those 3 breaths that we're looking at, that would be late cycle. You agree with that, Ari?
I don't know. I don't see much about the problem related to cycling. I see more the problems on the third of the breath. Rob, since we analyze almost everything, I know we have to determine the kind of mechanical ventilation goal at this time. If the goal is safety, this extra flow, it's giving a little extra flow for comfort, but the tidal volume is going to be a little bit higher. Some people can say, well, let's switch to pressure control. But when we liberate the flow by going to pressure control, we're also going to get maybe larger tidal volumes. So what would be the solution in this scenario?
Well, getting back to, we're focusing on the PVI in the cycle phase. So if we agree that this is late cycling, and if the goal was comfort, then you would have to allow the patient to cycle inspiration. And the only way to do that would be to do something like pressure support or NAVA or PAV or volume support, something along those lines. So if you're just concerned about, if you say the goal is safety for this or comfort for this patient right now, then I would have to agree that this is probably late cycling. And if you wanted to fix that, you have to let the patient cycle by changing the mode. Now, if the goal is safety, when safety overrides comfort, then putting them on pressure support will probably drastically reduce mean airway pressure. If they were having problems with oxygenation, that's probably not a good thing, right? And
Okay.
like you said, if these efforts are bigger than they look here, and the tidal volume might go well above what's already 500, right? On nearly 500.
Yes, it's a little bit below 500.
Yeah. So then if you said, well, I want this patient to be comfortable, but all of a sudden they're pulling 10 mLs per kilogram, then you have to go back and reassess what's the importance here. Okay, so now that gets this on to expiration. Let's look at the expiratory phase. I don't see any indication of PMUS during expiration except when the patient tries to trigger. And you see that triggering with the abrupt change in the direction of the flow curve. Or you want to put your little red line on that?
During expiration, you mentioned,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, during expiration when the patient makes the inspiratory effort. You had marked it before. So that's what we'd expect to see if they had a normal time constant or a short time constant. I think this patient has a long time constant. And right where the white line is right now, that's where the patient makes his inspiratory effort, because you see an abrupt change in the expiratory flow. The only way that's going to happen is if the patient makes an inspiratory effort. So there you have it. I don't see any failed trigger efforts. There's no false trigger happening. There's no indication of a leak that would cause false triggering. So there we go. Any other comments on that, Ari?
Not from my side.
Okay,
I-
we have about 5 minutes to go.
I can provide a following sequence, which is
Okay,
the same mode. I mean,
same
in
patient.
this case, the extra flow is not activated.
Is this the same patient?
Same patient.
Okay, so we still have the situation where the patient looks like a high respiratory rate. They're still making inspiratory efforts early in expiration. So that's causing them probably to have an increased effort to trigger inspiration. They're still flow triggering. They're still doing a fair amount of work shifting, as indicated by that red line. That red line is the pressure that you would see if this was a passive inflation. There was no PMUS. So we do have significant work shifting on this patient. Probably the patient's not very comfortable, right?
Yes, some people might say that the previous option, the adaptive flow, would bring a little bit more of comfort. But in many ways, we can appreciate the same kind of degree of work shifting. The
Right.
problem to decide if the work shifting is tolerable or it's I don't see that as a severe. So, but I agree that maybe switching to a pressure control mode would provide more comfort, but maybe at the expense of a higher tidal volume.
Right, and we still have the issue of the late cycling. So in this patient, if their respiratory drive was reliable, there's no reason why you couldn't go on pressure support, or maybe something, since they are on a servo, just put them in auto mode, right?
Yes.
So that would be our solution, I think, Ari, to put this patient on auto mode so that they could get spontaneous breaths if they wanted them. The timing would be in more synchronous with their PMS. And if they got tired out or something else happened, then the mandatory breaths would kick in.
Yeah, like you very well pointed out, depending on the mechanical ventilation goals, the first approach would be to liberate the flow by switching to a pressure control mode.
Right.
And the second approach would be to liberate the I time by switching to a mode that can have a variable light time. And if at the same time you want to serve the goal of safety, you can use a mode like auto mode, volume control to volume support, or auto mode to pressure control to pressure support, so you can serve the goal of safety and comfort.
Right. And if this patient was indeed a patient with high expiratory resistance, maybe a COPD patient, and at some point they were failing to trigger, then maybe NAVA would be the way to go there for that patient. For all those reasons you just said, and plus, avoiding any trigger problems because they couldn't generate the flow at the airway opening because of auto PEEP. Okay, we are out of time. It's 2:29. I want to thank you all for participating. I see a few people dropped out. Sorry for the technical difficulties, but we have CRCE credits available. Ryan has posted the link for that. Encourage you all to do that. And any other comments, Ari, before we sign off?
So far, we appreciate the people that stay there, and we are sorry we were not prepared for this, but we did the best we could.
Yep. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.